I want to walk you through the syllabus a little bit, but usually at this point the question arises about prerequisites and math. Yeah? Okay. The prerequisites for this course are intermediate macroeconomics and intermediate microeconomics. That's for the economics majors. Okay? If you're an economics major and you want to get major credit for this course, you have to have had those prerequisites beforehand. Okay? We don't make much use of those, but let me just talk about, but we could. And in other money and banking classes, they do. They start immediately from that. And at the end of the class, I will be connecting it up to the stuff that you know. So when I say intermediate macro and intermediate micro, let me explain what I mean by that. Because usually some students here are even from history or from law or something, and they haven't taken these courses, and so they're worried, okay, about these prerequisites. When I say intermediate macro, I mean this. Okay. Intermediate macro, this is a story about the determination of national income and the determination of the rate of interest, a nominal rate of interest. And we're used to thinking about monetary policy as shifting around the LM curve. And you could build a whole course around that, the foundations of the LM curve, Fed policy, the Taylor rule. You might argue that this LM curve should be horizontal and that you're trying to do inflation targeting maybe or something. We'll talk about all of those things, okay? But we're not really going to be starting from here and building the foundations of the LM curve. In fact, we'll be questioning the whole concept of a stable money demand curve or money supply curve. You know, so it's actually at a much more fundamental level that we're operating. So this is intermediate macro, and you will have seen that before. Intermediate micro is another diagram. This is economics, right? Consumption this period, consumption next period, and we have some kind of production possibility frontier that shows with the resources how we can produce this and produce that. And we have a tangent budget line here. And the slope of that line is minus 1 over 1 plus r, the real interest rate in this case. And we think of there being different kinds of human beings in this world, type 1 and type 2, where they are maximizing their utility. Okay, there's a first order condition for you, right? And creating a tangency and choosing, given we're imagining they both start with the same wealth, they have the same production possibilities, and then they trade. And this person says they want to consume more in period 1 than they're producing in period 1. And this person says, okay, they want to consume less in period 1 than they're producing in period 1 and more in period 2. Okay, so this is, person is borrowing, and this person is lending. If we bring money into the story, okay, there's this notion that what are financial markets doing? They're allowing people to do intertemporal trading in some way between people who want to consume more today and people who want to consume more tomorrow. And there's an interest rate that clears that market. This is intermediate micro. This is general equilibrium. This is a story about the determination of the real rate of interest. Okay? And sometimes this is called the Fisher diagram after Irving Fisher. And you could build a whole money and banking class around this, and people do. Okay? Thinking of banks, maybe there's some imperfection that keeps these people from meeting each other, asymmetric information or something like that, and banks or credit markets are sort of in between, trying to facilitate this flow of savings to investment and so forth, and theory of intermediation. You could build a whole theory of money and banking around this, and there are textbooks that do that. Okay, that's not what I'm doing in this class. Okay, we will come back to both of these points of view and connect up what we've learned to both of these points of view. But we're actually not starting from a set of economic apparatus and thinking, how can we apply this to banking? No, we're starting at the other side. You know, let's start from the concrete realities of banking and try to inductively draw from that some notion of how this thing works. What are its regularities? What kind of theoretical things can we say about it? Without imposing this structure right away. That's the strategy. So what is the analytical apparatus that we use in this class? I've been teaching this class for a long time. Let me just tell you that the first 2 weeks of this, you're going to experience as a little disorienting, okay? But then it will start to come together, and everyone at the end feels fine, okay? So it's just, and the reason it's disorienting is because you're used to grabbing onto that, okay? Or grabbing onto that and saying, oh yeah, I know where I am. You know, I recognize this from the past course. And there's not going to be stuff like that. You know, the very first stuff that you start reading is going to be things that are unfamiliar to you. And so that's just the way it's going to be. I sometimes tell students it's really fortunate that many of you had an experience as a first-year student or a second-year student, you know, saying, here's Nietzsche, just read Nietzsche and we'll talk about it tomorrow, you know, or something. So students rely on that background, that they know how to do that. That's okay. Don't worry about it. It will eventually make sense to you. Read it, do your best, and it will eventually come together. Just trust. It always does. And there is an intellectual tradition here with great care, great minds that are trying to figure this stuff out. And that's what we're trying to access. We're trying to think. What I always do when I'm reading the Financial Times, I say to myself, you know, what would Bagehot make of all of this? You know, or what would Minsky make of all of this? Or what would Fisher Black make of all of this? These are people I've written biographies of, right? So I can enter their minds and say, what would they make of this? Okay, that's how I think about the world always, is by just shifting gears back and forth. That's what I bring to the table. So I guess my answer is that I'm a member of my own little school, but I don't feel alone at all. I don't feel alone at all because I have all these ancestors here, and they're pretty great guys, actually. Monetary economics is all about books because it's so big. You got to write a treatise if you're really going to get anywhere in monetary economics. That's what I loved about it. That's why I chose monetary economics. I went down to the library, I saw that shelf of those books, and I said, if I could have a life reading all of those books just from left to right, that would be the best life ever. And that's the life I've had. The analytical apparatus is largely balance sheets. There's other stuff, too, that we'll get to in the class, but I just want to signal right now. Students that have some background in accounting or might find this a little bit easier than others, but sometimes not, because usually accounting classes teach you what the law is, what is GAAP accounting, and so forth. And we're not concerned here with what the law is. We're using balance sheets as an analytical structure to help us think rigorously about the economy. So let me just show you what I mean by that. We start with a bank. Okay. On the left-hand side is assets. On the right-hand side is liabilities. Why don't I just write that in here for the first time so that we remind ourselves. In general, I won't be writing it in. You'll just get used to knowing that assets are on the left and liabilities are on the right. Okay. And we could think of a bank as having some loans, some securities. So that might be like a treasury bill, and some cash reserves. It's more complicated than that, but. And on the liability side, you can think of this bank as having deposit accounts, I'm going to put in other borrowing because they might be issuing bonds or other kinds of short-term money market borrowing. In fact, that's going to be a very big part of this course, is understanding other borrowing. And then a balancing item here, net worth. Okay. This is what the balance sheet of a generic bank sort of looks like. And I'm drawing this to draw your attention to two sorts of issues that arise when we're thinking about banks. One is the issue of solvency. Is this bank solvent or not? We've been having some issues with that in the last few years. And Europe is having its issues now. Perhaps entire national banking systems are bankrupt in any literal solvent way. Solvency just means, is the value of the assets greater than the value of the liabilities so that the net worth is greater than zero? This being a balancing item, is the net worth greater than zero? So this is about the market value of assets versus the market value of liabilities. A lot of the discussion about banking systems is about that. But in this course, we're going to focus most attention, actually, on what is very specific about banking that makes them different from other corporations, okay, which is the issue of liquidity. Okay? And that's here, cash reserves. Okay? If a depositor transfers their deposit to somebody else, tries to make a payment to somebody else, does the bank have liquidity? Does it have cash reserves in order to make that payment? These are demand deposits. They can be withdrawn at any moment. Okay? Does it have its reserves? And if it doesn't, can it acquire them? Can it borrow them in the money markets? Okay? Can it go to the Fed ultimately to the window? Can it sell a security or repo a security? These are words you haven't heard. Okay? But you're going to know what these are pretty soon. Or does it have to liquidate these loans, sell them at a fire sale price? And if it does, what happens to solvency? If it sells them at a fire sale price, the assets are sold below their value. So there's a link between liquidity and solvency. Most economists approach banking by thinking first about solvency. We're going to approach banks by thinking first about liquidity and see where that leads us. And that's how bankers think. They face this liquidity constraint every day. They have to clear their accounts. The first 2 weeks of this course is about the payment system, oddly enough. Okay? But you'll see why. Okay? It will all connect up. This is a balance sheet of a traditional bank. But we're also going to be talking about shadow banks. I'm involved in a research team that's just finished a paper on shadow banking, which I'm going to be talking about at the end of the course. I wasn't sure I would finish it in time, so I put it at the end of the course. So this is assets and liabilities here. And when I talk about a shadow bank, I mean an entity that is holding, let's say, residential mortgage-backed securities. So these are loans that are turned into a bond of a kind. This is all just to give you an impression. By the way, all this lecture is all sort of written down and it's going to be posted in Courseworks too. You're going to get used to that so that you don't have to necessarily write everything down. But if that helps you, by all means do. Residential mortgage-backed securities, and then they strip out some of the risk, as much risk as possible from this, maybe with something called an interest rate swap. Okay, getting rid of the interest rate risk involved. Something like a credit default swap, getting rid of some of the credit risk, selling that off to somebody else so that what you have left is a short-term, relatively risk-free thing that you can use as collateral for borrowing in the wholesale money market. So there's money market borrowing here. They're not borrowing from you and me, okay? But they're borrowing from money market mutual funds. They're borrowing from big corporate investors. And the instruments they're using are things like repurchase agreements, RP, okay? Eurodollars, LIBOR, Eurodollar borrowing, asset-backed commercial paper, okay? We're going to understand what all these things are. It's not rocket science. But the point is that what has happened in the world is that this model became the dominant one. The amount of credit in the United States that ran through this sort of method became larger than that kind of method. The textbooks are all about that, okay? But reality is increasingly about that, and we need to bring that into our minds. Again, there's an issue of solvency. And an issue of liquidity. But it's not so easy as it is in the regular banking system. The issue of liquidity is really about being able to roll over this funding. Okay, using this as collateral for the funding. This is short-term funding. So if the money markets freeze up, you can't roll it over. You have to liquidate. Okay, this is what a lot of the financial crisis is about. Okay, is exactly this kind of problem. Okay, And I'm waving my hands now, okay, because I don't want to get into it too deep. But in a few weeks, you know, you'll understand all this stuff. This is not, it's not rocket science. It can be understood, and it's my mission to help people understand it. I think we're in a teaching moment in history where we need to understand this. The general population needs to understand how this stuff works, because we need to make some big decisions about how to regulate this new system. The regulatory system we have is all about that kind of banking, okay? And we don't really know what we're doing about regulating this. Dodd-Frank doesn't touch it, okay? So this is what the issue is about. So we're talking about banking. We're also talking about, the final thing here, I want to show you another. This is a bank. The central bank is a bank. This is the balance sheet of the Fed. Okay, that's from what does it say there? August 30th, 2012. Factors affecting reserve balances of depository institutions. What you see there, can you see it if I point here? Yeah, you can see that. So here, this is actually, they list on this page, this is all assets. So it's just the left-hand side of my balance sheet there. And you see what the Fed has there. U.S. Treasury securities are $1.6 trillion. Bills are short-term securities. They've sold them all off. They have no short-term securities anymore. Maybe you heard about this, that they were moving into long-term debt, and they have that. Notes and bonds, so forth. Federal agency debt securities, that's like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Mortgage-backed securities, these are private mortgage-backed securities. Okay, the Fed has bought mortgage-backed securities itself for the very first time ever in history. Okay, it never imagined it was ever going to do that. This is part of the legacy of the crisis. If you look down, and look, it's not like there's a small amount there. There's $852 billion. These are big numbers, the central bank here. These things here, Maiden Lane, all this is left over from the AIG and Lehman and all those sorts of things. And we can talk about, they're small numbers now. They were large numbers. Central bank liquidity swaps. These are the Fed lending to other central banks, to the ECB, to the Swiss National Bank, to the Bank of Japan. Okay, there's this whole, the point I want to emphasize, in many economics classes you've had, you talk about this, and you talk about MD equals MS, money demand equals money supply. Okay, now we're saying, well, what the actual things that are behind the scenes there are banks. Okay, and a central bank is a bank. It's not printing money. It has liabilities and assets. It's just not correct to say that it's printing money. When it's expanding the money supply, it's expanding both sides of the balance sheet, asset and liabilities at the same time. This is a classic banking operation. It happens at all levels, the central bank and also farther down. It's something we're going to pay a lot of attention to. So there you see the total size of the balance sheet is there $2.8 trillion. By the way, before the crisis, it was less than $1 trillion. So when I say that the size of the balance sheet tripled, that's about right. And here's the liability side. So you can see that the liabilities of the central bank are about $1 trillion of currency in circulation. That's green pieces of paper. Okay. There's also a bunch of other small numbers. Then there's this other big number, $1.5 trillion reserve balances with Federal Reserve banks. This is excess reserves. Okay, the banks have to hold reserves, cash reserves. These are held as deposits at the Fed. They're holding $1.5 trillion worth of those. $1.5 trillion worth of those. Before the crisis, that number was $50 billion. Okay, it's an order of magnitude change. The system has changed very dramatically. This sort of thing is when people talk about QE1, QE2, QE3, they're talking about the transformation of the Fed's balance sheet that I'm showing you here. This is stuff that we are going to try to understand in this course. I want to walk you through the syllabus a little bit, but usually at this point the question arises about prerequisites and math. Yeah? Okay. The prerequisites for this course are intermediate macroeconomics and intermediate microeconomics. That's for the economics majors. Okay? If you're an economics major and you want to get major credit for this course, you have to have had those prerequisites beforehand. Okay? We don't make much use of those, but let me just talk about, but we could. And in other money and banking classes, they do. They start immediately from that. And at the end of the class, I will be connecting it up. I want to walk you through the syllabus a little bit, but usually at this point the question arises about prerequisites and math. Yeah? Okay. The prerequisites for this course are intermediate macroeconomics and intermediate microeconomics. That's for the economics majors. Okay? If you're an economics major and you want to get major credit for this course, you have to have had those prerequisites beforehand. Okay? We don't make much use of those, but let me just talk about, but we could. And in other money and banking classes, they do. They start immediately from that. And at the end of the class, I will be connecting it up to the stuff that you know. So when I say intermediate macro and intermediate micro, let me explain what I mean by that. Because usually some students here are even from history or from law or something, and they haven't taken these courses, and so they're worried, okay, about these prerequisites. When I say intermediate macro, I mean this.